This is Covering the Spread, part of the FanDuel Podcast Network.
A lot of interesting games and interesting situations at hand for week number 4 across the NFL. We're going to break those down from a prop betting perspective and get JJ Zacharyson's read on those and get you some profitable bets for this week over at FanDuel Sportsbook. This is Covering the Spread right here on the FanDuel Podcast Network and numberFire.com. My name is Jim Sonis. I am a senior writer and analyst for numberFire.com, joined here once again by JJ Zachariason. Check him out on Twitter at LateRoundQB. You can find his work at LateRound.com and the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast. JJ, happy Friday. Happy week 4. How you doing today?
Happy Friday. I could be doing better if Treylon Burks didn't fall at the 1-inch line last week in that plus 280 bet that we talked about. That was unfortunate, but I'm doing all right. I'm hoping that this week is better than the first two that I've been on the show. You know, the bets that I've shared on the show. They've just been so close, some of these. So I think we're in a good spot.
We talked about that Tuesday. The Brady stuff was also kind of annoying with the way that it worked out. But then you did nail it, the Ramondre Stevenson stuff, talking about how, you know, his role is better than it seemed in that one game. And no matter what market you would have taken Stevenson in, because numbers were not up when we spoke, but no matter what you did, if it was a rushing yardage prop, receiving yardage prop, rushing plus receiving yardage prop, or touchdown prop, he would have checked every single box there. So the read on the situation was good. The read on the role for Treylon Burks, who I think ran a route on like every drop back in that game. The read on the situation was great, which I think bodes well for the long-term process here.
I hope. Travis Etienne was over too. So we got the Etienne. I think the most shocking from last week was the Brady stuff. I really thought that was the strongest bet that we had talked about last week. And then, the game script went the way that it went. And, he hit that over in the final drive. So it was at least close.
I think with the way your luck went Sunday, the most fitting thing would have been Etienne catching like a negative 16-yard screen to get back to 14 receiving yards. Cause he was over 16 and a half, like right away. So that would have been the way that things would have gone. For you on Sunday, but the process was good. We'll hope to spin that forward for week 4 as well. We'll break down what JJ likes from a prop perspective for this week in just 1 second. But first, a reminder to check out the Covering the Spread podcast feed for our NFL week 4 full betting preview with Ryan Williams, our college football betting preview. We had Colin Wilson on this week with Dr. Ed Feng to break down their favorite bets for this week. Also, all of these podcasts up on the FanDuel YouTube page as well. Twisted Tea and FanDuel join forces to bring you a one-of-a-kind contest series. Gives you a chance to compete for your share of thousands of dollars in site credits. Introducing Twisted Tea's College Football Picks, a sports betting-focused contest series that's entirely free to play. The contest is simple. Each college football team will be assigned money line, spread, and total markets with assigned points to each market. All you have to do is make 6 selections based on those 3 markets and earn points for each correct selection you made. If at the end of the day your score ranks among the best in the contest, you'll be eligible for your share of site credit. Head to FanDuel.com/TwistedTeaPicks and make your picks. Reminder, please drink responsibly. Let's dig into week number 4 here. And the key thing that I saw, JJ, was weather for this week, because a lot of games on the East Coast specifically impacted by Hurricane Ian. Obviously, the non-football impacts of this are far more important than the football impacts, and that matters more. We do want to talk about this from a prop betting perspective. Forecasts might shift by Sunday, but just in general, from a broad perspective, how does weather factor into your process with betting props?
Yeah, look, Hurricane Ian might be factoring into my Friday night plans here in Charlotte tonight. So I feel it. I'm feeling the effects of Hurricane Ian, even though it's not even close to what it was felt down in Florida. The big thing with weather, as we have talked about plenty of times, and as every analyst has talked about, is wind. I mean, you really want to make sure that wind is ideally under 15 miles an hour is okay. Once you get to that 15 miles an hour mark, it starts to get a little bit iffy. And then if you get to that 20 miles an hour, that's when you really got to pay attention. But I think that a lot of people look at this from the standpoint of only passing, because obviously whenever you're throwing against the wind like that, it's just crazy and field goals and stuff like that. That's like the obvious go-to when it comes to wind. But again, I look at my projections from a top down and I take a top down approach. And what this really does, it changes the offense entirely. You're going to see these game totals drop. And when game totals drop, that obviously impacts, there's a reason for that. And it obviously impacts the players in that game. And so from a prop betting standpoint, just pay attention to that kind of stuff. And if these guys' lines aren't reacting quick enough to what the game total is doing or what this weather looks like, then that's when you can pounce. So always understand that with wind in particular, a little bit of rain's fine, unless you get like the monsoon that we saw week one against with Chicago and San Francisco, it's not that big of a deal. Even snow is not the biggest deal in the world. I mean, we've seen Tom Brady. Remember that Tom Brady game where he had like 18 touchdowns? I think it was against like Tennessee up in New England way back in the day. So, snow's even not that big of a deal unless you get a blizzard game like the Philadelphia game. We always go back to that LaShawn McCoy game, right?
Oh, yeah.
So that stuff matters, but wind is the big predictor. And so just pay attention to that factor and how that impacts the offense as a whole, not just passing. So even rushing numbers, you shouldn't feel, or even especially rushing touchdown totals.
Correct.
You shouldn't feel as good about that stuff because the team and the offense in general is just not going to perform as well.
I think that's the thing that goes overlooked is people think, oh, they'll run the football more. They'll, the running back, we just bet every market for running backs. But like totals come down, like you said, and that impacts everybody's touchdown market. So if you like a number, you need better value on it if there's going to be wind on it to make sure it's still a good number after accounting for that wind. And just having that in mind. Like you said with rain, I don't care unless it's a monsoon or I guess hurricane. But it sounds like for most of these games, the actual rain itself will not be that bad during the games. And that might honestly be an advantage for offense because they know where they're going and the defense does not. And that's a big thing too. So I'd agree the biggest takeaway being touchdown props and the yardage props, making sure you're accounting for that fully. Now, the other factor at play for this week is that we have a lot of teams changing quarterbacks. The Jets get Zach Wilson back. The Patriots have most likely Brian Hoyer. I don't think Mac Jones has officially been ruled out yet, but probably going to be Brian Hoyer there. Now, you project things, as you said, from a top-down perspective. So when you're doing that with a team that has a new quarterback in place, what questions are you asking yourself when a team has the potential to fundamentally change the way they're operating?
Yeah, I think the big question you ask is, does this quarterback have certain tendencies? Brian Hoyer, going from Mac Jones to Brian Hoyer, it's sort of like a system quarterback situation there with Mac Jones. I'm not saying that he's necessarily a system quarterback, but he's not there yet. You could
probably say that.
Yeah,
okay.
we don't know if Mac Jones is going to be this like absolute superstar and stellar player. The one thing with Mac Jones that's kind of wild though is he's actually chucking it deep at a pretty good rate this year. So I would expect that to probably drop maybe a little bit with Brian Hoyer, then not be as aggressive as they've been with Mac Jones. But at the same time, that's also factoring in the Packers have a pretty good defense and secondary. But they will be in a negative game script too, more than likely, just given the spread. So, I think it's more neutral for New England overall. I'm not really that concerned with how I would view some of these guys. Maybe, we've seen Jacoby Myers with really awesome target shares with Mac Jones. And if he goes this week, because he didn't play last week, but if he goes this week, maybe bump that down a little bit just because, there are quarterback to wide receiver and pass catcher tendencies that we just see. Because just naturally as human beings, you like throwing to certain players. I think that's natural. The one thing with the Jets that's really interesting, there's actually a lot of stuff with the Jets right now that's pretty crazy. So the Jets right now have a 73% pass rate on the season, which is just absurd. The highest pass rate of any team since 2011 was 67%. That's from the 2013 Atlanta Falcons. That's when they had like Dirk Cutter, and actually Harry Douglas led that team in targets that year because Julio Jones got hurt. But they were at 67%. The Jets are at a 73% pass rate right now. So that's inevitably going to regress. Like that's not going to sustain. And I think what's going to happen is Zach Wilson steps in. They're playing the Steelers this week with a 3-point spread. So it's likely going to be a fairly close game, not necessarily a super negative game script. And so the Jets are probably not going to pass as much. And then people are going to attribute that to being a Zach Wilson thing, but it's really just a regression thing and a game script thing overall, right? But the other thing too, that I think we really should pay attention to is that over the last year and a half, we've seen these backup quarterbacks for the Jets really, really target their running backs through the air. I mean, a lot. I mean, so far this year, the Jets running backs have a 28% target share. Only the Bills, which is kind of crazy that the Bills are higher. The Broncos and the Chargers are higher. Broncos and Chargers make a ton of sense. But the Jets are at a really high target share this year at the running back position. They did that last year with Mike White when he stepped in. But Zach Wilson last season, he had a running back target share of about 19%. So, it's dramatically lower. So you sort of compound those factors where the Jets probably aren't going to pass as much. It's just natural. That's just regression. And then on top of that, those running backs probably aren't going to see as much work through the air. So I do think that you could look. I didn't see anything crazy in the markets right now or anything necessarily this week, but even if you're thinking fantasy, I mean, you could bump down Breece Hall and Michael Carter just a little bit, because I do think that we're going to see a little bit of a different tendency from Zach Wilson, from Joe Flacco. And then again, we've seen a lot of Garrett Wilson love over the first 3 weeks, and he's a phenomenal player. Yeah. But we could also see that revert back a little bit more to Elijah Moore, who is running more routes and who's seen better participation overall than Garrett Wilson. So just watch out for those kinds of factors. Again, I don't know if there's anything in the market right now that says pounce on this, but I do think that information is just important to have, entering the week.
Weird that you would say they're due for regression when Breece Hall has double-digit targets in 2 games. Like, it's odd you wouldn't find that sustainable. I'm a little suspicious of that. Okay, so last week we talked about the Patriots. Their running backs in a situation to target for that week. Let's open that up again this week. Obviously, it's only week 4. A lot of roles still in flux. Any specific situations you're looking at, whether props are up right now or not, to try to attack?
I'd say there's 2. One of them we already talked about with Treylon Burks. He saw his lowest target share and production of the season last week against Vegas, which doesn't make that much sense logically, but he had his best route participation. He ran the most routes for Tennessee this past week, which is the first time that's ever happened. He had by far his best snap rate last week. So the Treylon Burks stuff is trending upward. It's trending upward literally every week. So it's good to see that usage. He's going to pop eventually, as long as he's a good enough player, of course, but he should pop eventually. And then the other situation that I think is kind of interesting is the Kansas City backfield. Week 1, Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Jerick McKinnon tied in snaps played. And everyone's like, okay, whatever. It's not that big of a deal. There was a weird game script in that game, what have you. But in weeks 2 and 3, Jerick McKinnon has outsnapped in each game Clyde Edwards-Helaire. And I think that, folks are watching those games. CEH looks better than he looked last year. But there's been a lot of fortune for CEH in terms of how many touchdowns he scored so far. He had one of the biggest plays of I think his career a couple weeks ago against the Chargers. So I actually think that you could look at this backfield and favor Jerick McKinnon a little bit more than CEH, because snaps translate to more volume, to more production, et cetera, et cetera. So that's definitely a backfield that I think is being a little bit overlooked right now. Because CEH, I think a lot of people recognize that what he's doing right now is a little bit fluky, but I'm not sure they realize how much Jerick McKinnon is actually playing.
Yeah, and it's been a lot of production for CEH on very minimal usage, and that's not really sustainable typically, especially for a guy who's had question marks around skill so far. I want to go back to Treylon Burks for a second here. Yardage prop, I think, just went up at FanDuel Sportsbook. I'm not going to put you on the spot, but 38.5 is the receiving yardage number for Burks. I feel like based on the route numbers, that's probably a bit too low.
Yeah, I would agree.
Okay. Yeah. I'd agree with that as well. So let's dig into other yardage props available over at FanDuel Sportsbook for this week. Any popping to you right now based on what you're seeing?
Yeah, I've got 3 of them for you. First off, I think that you have to monitor the weather a little bit. Right now, we looked at this right before we started recording, that Baltimore-Buffalo game, which projects to be probably the highest scoring of the week. I mean, just the most potential to shoot out with Lamar Jackson on one side and Josh Allen on the other, and the Ravens still keeping up a decent pass rate. And obviously Buffalo this season, they've been the 6th most pass-friendly team overall. So that's despite game script. But then you look at neutral script and they're 4th. So they're still a very pass-heavy team. Josh Allen right now, his line for passing yardage is at 286.5. It's over on FanDuel Sportsbook at -114. I like the over right now, because right now you're seeing sub 15-mile-an-hour winds. Light rain shouldn't impact the game that dramatically. The Ravens are 21st this year in success rate allowed through the air. Allen's hit this mark in each game this year, and 2 of those games were blowouts. You often, last week Josh Allen threw it like 63 times or something against Miami, in what was more of a neutral / sort of negative game script, but more neutral overall. But it's good to see that even if this game goes in the Bills' favor, Allen can still hit the over in this game. I think what's going on here is that weather is being factored in to this line at 286.5. Realistically, it probably should be closer to like 295, maybe 300. So I think that right now is a good time to hit the over, just given the current weather forecast, because I think the current weather forecast right now is not too bad.
Yeah, and with Josh Allen, they can't run the football. So that the alternative is to run, and they can't. That's what they showed last week. Yeah. Unless it's Josh Allen running. I wish we had like a rushing plus passing yardage prop at FanDuel. That'd be pretty good. I think that I'd agree with your read on the weather right now. 14 miles per hour is a downgrade, but it's not a downgrade enough where I think that we're going under 286.5. So
yeah,
I do like that one for sure. What are the ones sticking out to you?
Yeah, so I have two more. I have a two running back unders actually. So Najee Harris right now over on DK Sportsbook is at -114 at 67.5 rushing yards. I'm smashing the under there. You can't assume a super positive game script for the Steelers in any game, let alone this, even against the Jets. I mean, they're only 3-point favorites against the Jets. The Jets have the 7th best success rate allowed to running backs this season. And that includes a game against the Browns, where obviously the Browns can run the ball very effectively. They're also 3rd in adjusted target share to running backs. So basically, teams against the Jets have funneled targets towards the running back position, but that's through the air. Whereas on the ground, they've been able to stop these running backs. So I wouldn't look at a total yardage prop for Najee Harris because of that, but I would look at the rushing yards and say, yeah, I mean, Najee hasn't hit these marks in each of his last 5 games. And the majority of those games were positive or neutral game scripts for Pittsburgh. So I think that this is a pretty safe bet for Najee to pound the under at 67.5. And then the other one, another under, Cam Akers over on DK is currently at 42.5 rushing yards, and that's -115. The Rams use Darrell Henderson. This is another backfield that's sort of up in the air. We don't really know exactly what they're trying to do. What it feels like to me is that they want to use Cam Akers really, really badly, but he's doing everything to say, don't use me. I mean, he's, he's fumbling at the goal line.
I'm begging you, don't use me.
Yeah, right. Fumbling at the goal line. He's just not super effective. And I don't think Darrell Henderson is necessarily this like true bell cow back, but in the first half last week, the Rams did use Darrell Henderson more than Cam Akers, despite that 12-4 rush attempt split between the two. They get San Francisco this week. San Francisco is the 4th best success rate allowed to the running back position. They can stop the run. And the other thing, too, that's interesting is, we always look for game script dependent running backs. And so far this year, Darrell Henderson, at least over the last 2 weeks when we've seen more Cam Akers, we can even throw out that week 1 game where Henderson was the bell cow for them. But even over the last 2 weeks, Henderson, according to 4for4 Stat Explorer, he's playing 84% of their 3rd down snaps over the last 2 weeks. So if this game goes south, we're going to see more Darrell Henderson on the field. Right. And it also just sets up generally as a Darrell Henderson game. I mentioned adjusted target share with Najee Harris and the Jets. The 49ers so far rank 1st in adjusted target share allowed to running backs. They're 32nd to tight ends. So teams are not necessarily looking to the tight end position. They're looking to the running back position, sort of closer to the line of scrimmage. That favors a Darrell Henderson much more than a Cam Akers. So I think game plan wise, Henderson makes a little bit more sense. Akers had a fumble again last week. He might be in the doghouse a little bit. It's not like he's been that effective. I know that he's hit the over with this line over the last 2 weeks, but they've also played Arizona and Atlanta. And this is a much different defense than those defenses. So I like the under 42.5 for Cam Akers.
Yeah, tough defensive line there. And I hope that the game script does not go awry, because I do have Rams +2.5, but I think that the thought process there is correct. Maybe a late game comeback for the Rams to cover my 2.5, where they lean on Darrell Henderson later on. Also with the Najee Harris one, the Jets defensive line is sneaky good. Brandon Thorne at Establish the Run does like an offensive versus defensive line like mismatch column each week. I've not gotten to read that yet. I would not be shocked if that one is in there, because the Jets defensive line, I would say, much better than perception. Let's open up the touchdown props. JJ, what are you seeing over there for this week?
I got one. I have one touchdown prop for you lovely listeners this week, and it is Courtland Sutton +155 over on FanDuel Sportsbook. Anytime touchdown. Vegas very beatable in that secondary. They have the 3rd worst success rate allowed through the air this season. Courtland Sutton has 291 receiving yards this year and a goose egg in the touchdown column. But from an expected touchdown standpoint, he should have been expected, just given where he's seeing his looks and how much volume he's seeing and how many yards he's accumulated. He should be closer to 2. So, this line right now, +155, even if he had scored one of those touchdowns, I feel like that line would be a lot lower. I think that this could be a get-right game for Denver. If you look at all of Denver's sort of peripheral numbers, they've been really bad in the red zone, yes, but their yards per drive has been, fairly average, above average. Their scoring rate per drive has even been decent enough. It's just that they're not finding the end zone. I think this could be that get-right game for them. So Courtland Sutton, anytime touchdown, +155.
This one very much aligns with my financial interests, given I have the Broncos money line, and I'm going to have a lot of Sutton in DFS. So prayers up. We get that first touchdown and second touchdown and third touchdown for Cortland Sutton for this week. That is JJ Zachariason. Check him out on Twitter at Late Round QB. You can find the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast. A link to that is up in the show notes over on numberFire.com, and check out JJ's work. Check out his Patreon at lateround.com. JJ, thank you so much as always for coming on once again this week. Good luck to you across week 4. We'll talk to you once again next week.
Thanks, Jim.
I am on Twitter at Jim Sonis. You can also find the FanDuel Podcast Network at FanDuel Podcast. Once again, our Week 4 full betting preview is up on the Covering the Spread feed, and our College Football Week 5 podcast there as well. Go find that. Good luck to all of you. We'll talk to you once again Monday to preview Monday Night Football. This has been Covering the Spread right here on the FanDuel Podcast Network.